Good morning, everyone. Good morning. And thank you, Wendy, for your introduction. In spite of these so-called credentials that I have in my education, what I really am at heart is a storyteller. And so instead of a traditional sermon, I'm going to be telling you a story today, the story of a remarkable man. A man but for whom none of us would probably be here today, certainly in this particular church, worshipping in the particular way that we worship following the Book of Common Prayer that we find every Sunday in our pews. That man's name was Thomas Cranmer. He was born in 1489 and died in 1556. He was the first Protestant Archbishop of Canterbury and the spiritual father of the Protestant Church in England, and by extension, the Episcopal Church in America and the even greater worldwide Anglican community of which we are all a part. Although Cranmer had been dead for several years when the English Parliament finally enacted a settlement that made England forever officially a Protestant country, the particular form of Protestantism that was enacted in 1559 in the reign of Elizabeth I, the particular brand, and what makes it distinct from, say, Lutheranism or Calvinism or any other of the isms, we owe largely to Thomas Cranmer. It was Cranmer who, as Archbishop of Canterbury, placed the English language Bible in every parish church. It was Cranmer who was personally responsible for writing the earliest iterations of the Book of Common Prayer, on which all other prayers, Book of Common Prayer, are based since then. It was Cranmer who composed our liturgy, litany, and many of our collects, which are still in use to this day. His theology, his pen, his personality are indelibly stamped on the way we pray and practice in our worship services to this day. A few years ago, when I was in Paris, I visited a 19th century Protestant church, really on the tourist map. It sits unassumingly on the left bank of the Seine, and to the degree that it's famous at all, it's famous for its magnificent Tiffany stained glass windows. Absolutely glorious. But what struck me there was another window, large window, depicting the four giants of the 16th century Protestant Reformation: Martin Luther, John Calvin, John Knox, and Thomas Cranmer. Towering figures in terms of the impact that they had on both religion, and Christianity of course, and Western society in the 16th century. And yet, as I reflected on this, as these guys were standing up there together, I didn't have particularly pious thoughts, I must say. What came to mind was an old jingle from Sesame Street that some of you may be old enough to remember. I don't think they do it anymore, but it goes like this. Three of these things belong together. Three of these things are kind of the same. One of these things is not like the other. Now it's time to play our game. Which one are we talking about? Well, don't get me wrong. Cranmer deserves to be up there with the other three. And he is the only one of the three who paid with his life for his Protestant beliefs. But his personality was entirely different from the other ones. To have the kind of impact in the 16th century that these men had, you had to be tough as nails. John Knox served 5 years as a galley slave. Martin Luther famously spent his adult life being hunted by those who wanted to burn him at the stake, and John Calvin fled his own country of France to avoid a similar fate. To make it in the 16th century, particularly in matters of politics and religion, which were basically one and the same thing, you had to be ruthless in pursuit of your chosen path, committed to your beliefs with a kind of almost fanaticism that allowed no compromise and certainly not an examination of self-motives. You had to see things in black and white, good and evil, right and wrong. Enemies were enemies to be crushed at all costs, and friends to be regarded warily. Cranmer wasn't like that. Unlike his boss, King Henry VIII of England, who was the quintessential Renaissance Machiavellian prince, and Henry's chief political advisor, Thomas Cromwell, who did what they did for political reasons, personal gain, and just good old-fashioned revenge, Cranmer forgave his enemies, didn't hold a grudge against anyone, even those who plotted against him. He even took a couple of them into his household to sort of give them a nicer time than they were having before. He never put his interests first. He never sought power for power's sake or abused it. And he was, for his day, remarkably tolerant for those who disagreed with him, always seeking to find a compromise. For these virtues, many of his contemporaries viewed him as naive, indecisive, even cowardly. And yet it was this man's singular act of courage and faith as he burned at the stake that turned the government, what the government hoped would be a propaganda coup for the Catholic Church, into a beacon of hope for the beleaguered Protestant cause. But that wasn't the way that people who knew Cranmer at the time would have expected it to turn out, least of all Cranmer himself. So to begin at the beginning, Cranmer was born into the ranks of the lower gentry. That meant that his family had neither the money nor the influence to provide for his career. Fortunately, Cranmer was a brilliant student who won a scholarship to Cambridge. But like most poor scholars of his day, that meant a career in the church. Now, that suited Cranmer just fine, except for one thing. He wasn't a natural celibate. Well, most of them weren't actually, but Cranmer made the big mistake of getting married and falling in love and was promptly fired from his job because in those times that was forbidden. No cleric could be married. So sadly for Cranmer, the marriage didn't last. His wife died in childbirth, which was also fairly typical of the 16th century, and Cranmer was promptly reinstated. He then took full vows as a priest, celibate priest, and became known as a remarkable scholar who gathered around him other distinguished scholars. He became a magnet for them, particularly scholars that were drawn to what was called the new learning. This was a more critical scholarly approach to theology and scriptures than had been practiced by the medieval church. And in fact, the group soon became known as Little Germany because of the number of scholars there who were influenced by Martin Luther and his break with Rome. Also, they included quite a number of future Protestant martyrs. Most notably, I think, William Tyndale, the writer of the translator of the English Bible, which we referred to earlier as being placed in every church by Cranmer, and of course, Cranmer himself. By temperament, Cranmer was a scholar, not interested in politics and power in least, and certainly he had no taste for martyrdom. Left to his own devices, he would probably have remained in the safety of his cloisters in Cambridge during these very turbulent years that were to follow in the political and religious scene in England. But fate, or perhaps we should say God, intervened. The year was 1529, and a plague broke out in London. Henry VIII of England was beginning his divorce proceedings at this time against his wife of 20 years, Catherine of Aragon. And he was also a germaphobe, and he certainly did not want to stay in London, so he fled to the country, and as fate, or again God would have it, he ended up in the same village as Cranmer, who shared lodgings with two of Henry's chief counsellors. Inevitably, the conversation got round to what was euphemistically referred to as the king's great matter. It was supposed to be a secret, but it wasn't, which was his divorce. And Cranmer came up with a number of brilliant theological arguments from Scripture in favour of the divorce. He also suggested that Henry put his case to the universities in Europe to distinguish scholars for their opinion, which he kind of felt confident would go in Henry's favour. Henry heard this and summoned Cranmer to his presence. The interview obviously went rather well because Henry ended up by giving Cranmer a prestigious commission to write a propaganda piece in favour of the divorce, which he did. And obviously well done, and Henry was pleased and gave him further honours. He was sent on, as part of the embassy, to the Holy Rome, first of all to the papacy, to Rome to plead the king's case. Didn't go so well, but that wasn't Cranmer's fault. He was then created ambassador to the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, the most powerful monarch in Europe at the time, where he spent some years. Again, the universities came out in favour of Henry, but not so much the Pope or the Emperor. And Henry didn't make too much progress with his divorce. However, Cranmer was now a figure of some note. I should say at this point, one of the byproducts of him being in Europe was that he spent a great deal of time with the reform-minded scholars, particularly those in Germany and Switzerland, and was very much influenced by their increasingly reform-minded Protestant opinions. Second thing, on a more personal note, Cranmer fell in love again and got married, which was an extremely bold move for him because he was not a pushy man, and also, obviously, not really a move that was guaranteed to advance his career. But the real turning point in Cranmer's career did, in fact, take place very shortly after this hasty marriage, or not very thoughtful marriage, in 1532, when the Archbishop of Canterbury, William Wareham, died, leaving Henry with a vacancy that he had to fill. Now embroiled in the middle of his divorce, he needed a top theologian, one that supported his position, and preferably one unencumbered with any alliances or allegiances other than the king himself. And so, in spite of the fact that Cranmer was hardly qualified in terms of experience, Henry appointed him anyway, to the fury and frustration of those who felt themselves more qualified. These included a man by the name of Stephen Gardiner, Bishop of Winchester. And for those of you who have ever read Hilary Mantel's novels, Wolf Hall, or seen the BBC series based on those novels, or really seen any of those Tudor things, Stephen Gardiner usually sort of crawls in somewhere as the bad guy, and deservedly so, in my opinion. He was someone who certainly did things for personal gain. A bigger problem for Cranmer, however, than his personal embarrassment with his marriage and his lack of experience was the fact that he was now surrounded by the upper echelons of Henry's council, laity and clergy, most of whom were perfectly happy to stay with what was called the old religion, while he, Cranmer, was moving closer and closer to the Protestant doctrine and practices in church. Now, these men were perfectly happy to get rid of the Pope and benefit from the redistribution of church wealth and land, which came with the dissolution of the monasteries, but they were conservative, very conservative in their religious faith. This included Henry VIII, who, although he had broken with Rome, declared himself supreme head of the English church, dissolved the monasteries, remained, in his own mind at least, a devout son of the church until his dying day. And so, in spite of Henry's fondness for Cranmer and his trust in Cranmer, illustrated by a sidebar, he protected Cranmer from a number of plots to get rid of him, mostly headed by Stephen Gardiner. And also, as he was dying, most touchingly, Cranmer was the only person that he wanted in the room with him and held his hand to the end when he died. But in spite of this, the king gave Cranmer very little political power to effect the changes he would like to have seen in the church. All this changed with the accession of Henry's son, 9-year-old Edward VI. He was a child, and therefore the country was run by two protectors, or regents, if you like, in his stead, both of them fervent Protestants. And as a result, although Edward's reign was very short, radical institutional changes took place not only in the doctrine of the church and the liturgy, which is particularly reflected in Cranmer's 2 books of common prayer that he produced in very short order in 1549 and 1552. Also, the institution of 42 articles of religion, later reduced to 39, thankfully, but these codified the position of the Church of England, that to this day is known as the via media, somewhere between the Catholic faith and extreme Protestantism, a typical Cranmer compromise. Well, I'm not going to go into the weeds of the theological changes because some of them are over my head, but they're certainly over the head of the common man and woman in the street at the time. What they would have been impacted by more than the doctrinal changes was the changes to the exterior experience in church, which we talked about. The stripping of the altars, as it came to be known as, of all vestiges of the Catholic faith. This included, as Wendy mentioned, everything on the altar that we see, candles, flowers, no incense, most annoyingly of all saints' days, which were holidays. I'm sure that didn't go down well. The removal of saints from church, the relics removed, even the stained glass windows. The liturgy was greatly simplified, and music, alas, reduced to plain song. Thankfully, some of these changes did not last. But the extremists were in charge at the time, and that's what happens. Upon the death of Edward in 1553, he was only 15 at the time, there was another radical swing back. Henry's eldest daughter, Mary Tudor, a devout Catholic, came to the throne, determined to stamp out heresy in her country, in England, and to crush or eliminate all those associated with it. Number 1 target was Thomas Cranmer, and this was personal for Mary. She held Cranmer responsible for the divorce of her beloved mother, Catherine of Aragon, to Henry VIII, and never forgave him. The Archbishop was indicted for heresy, treason, and anything else they could think of, and thrown into the most miserable Tudor dungeons you can only imagine, where now in his mid-60s, he spent a miserable 2.5 years, constantly harassed by agents of the government to change his views, to embrace the Catholic Church, and so on. On the principle that bludgeoning continues until morale improves, he was also forced to watch the burning and execution of 2 of his fellow bishops, Ridley and Latimer. So now broken in health and no doubt traumatized by the relentless bullying of government agents, Cranmer recanted his Protestant beliefs 5 times. On his final abject recantation, he repudiated his entire religious development, his whole life's work. It was a great coup for the government, but even this didn't save him. He was still condemned to die the death of a heretic, a dreadful death that he had hoped to avoid. Before being led to the stake, he was subjected to one further humiliation. He was obliged to give a public sermon in which he denied the doctrines that he had held true to and embracing the Catholic faith. To the utter consternation and, of course, fury of his tormentors, Cranmer did no such thing. Instead, he abjured his own recantation, affirmed his Protestant beliefs, and promised to put to the fire first the offending hand that had signed the document. In an extraordinary act of courage, Cranmer found the strength to do just this. And he held his hand steadfastly to the flames until it burned, thus robbing the government of its victory and restoring hope to the Protestant cause in England, a hope that was realized and fulfilled 2 years later only, when Henry VIII's youngest daughter and Cranmer's goddaughter, ascended the throne as Elizabeth I, the Protestant Elizabeth I. But that's another story. Thank you.